Well, thank you for coming back. I appreciate that Paris has a lot of attractions to offer, and seeing a fat Indian 50-year-old talking may not be one of them, but I'm going to try my best to kind of keep you awake for the next half hour. So my theme really is about how do we make sure that in this world where we're hearing about all this scary science and technology, automation, artificial intelligence, all these things, how do we make sure we don't lose sight of humanity? How do we make sure that people are at the center of whatever we try to do as organizations, whether or not those people are going to stay in our business? John Williams also gave me a very kind introduction. He described me as a very scary man. So that's another way of looking at what I'm going to do for you. And I'm going to draw on two things. One is the copy of the book that you have in front of you. The other is the book we're working on right now, which is all about how do we create that human future, rather than assuming that the technology is going to drive it all, and money will drive it all. How do we make sure we put people at the center of the story? And the reality is that if we look at the change going on in the world today, on the one hand, it's very exciting. We see some very big global challenges ahead of us. And the other side, we see what people are saying are existential risks. Could artificial intelligence be so clever that it actually decides it doesn't need humans anymore? Could nanotechnology suddenly change the way things work in society that we just don't understand them? Could we create weapons that will destroy us because they're making their own choices? You know, there are all these sorts of views that saying this science could benefit us, but it could also create risks. This is a challenge for us as business leaders because we haven't necessarily had to think about what are the broader social impacts of the things we're investing in or the things we'll be investing in the next few years. And we also know that we're at a kind of incredible point in history where we're seeing two planets collide. On the one hand, there's the world of those who are born physical. We make cars, we build houses, we do things that are largely physical, or we think in a very physical way. We might use technology in our business, but it's a cost center. We don't see ourselves as technology businesses. But we're now colliding with a world of people who are born digital, who think digital. So they don't see cars, they don't see houses, they don't see people. All they see is data. And they believe that the challenge is around finding the data, using the right algorithms to manipulate that data, and then putting the right science and technology in there to change the world. So someone like Google are just as happy running a search engine as creating the world's biggest mobile phone operating system. They now have driverless vehicles that have driven more than 2 million kilometers. They have a life extension company that is aiming to add 50 years to your life expectancy. And for them, there is no difference in any of these companies. For them, they're all data companies. And that's where we're seeing this clash between these two worlds. Because the challenge for all of us is to say, how do we start to put digital at the heart of our business? How do we create digital mindsets so we can compete in the world we're moving into and make sure that the people we have in our organizations are capable of surviving that fast-changing world? One of the biggest challenges we face, though, is that those born digital companies are doing something that some of us struggle with, which is they're inspiring passion. They're attracting young people who have passion. They're not necessarily thinking they're going to change the world, but they have huge opportunity. So you're seeing 22-year-olds joining Uber to become country manager somewhere, and being told that it's your responsibility to sign up 100,000 drivers in a year, your responsibility to take on the legal system, your responsibility to make it all happen. If you make a mistake, we'll work it out. But go for it, that's your goal. Now let's contrast that with some other organizations. You know, some of us, I'm sure none of you, but we're in an organization where when that 22-year-old joins, they get given the photocopying to do. And after 2 or 3 years, we promote them and they're allowed to push the mail around. And we say to them, you know, when we want your opinion, we'll give it to you. We're seeing that the real challenge, and I hear this from CEO after CEO, which is, how do we bring passion back into our organization? I've got a lot of hungry ghosts in my organization, people who do whatever they're told, but they've lost their passion, they've lost their drive, they've lost their energy. So when they see all this scary stuff coming, the only response they've got is to be scared of it, rather than saying, how do we get into the future by exploring it and creating what we want, rather than being on the receiving end of shocks and risks. And what we also see is that there's a response that we see quite a lot from people where when they hear about this stuff, they say, well, I haven't heard it, I haven't seen it, it's not my experience, or they've been told about artificial intelligence for the last 20 years, it hasn't changed my world, therefore it won't. Well, actually it has. If you fly on a plane, if you use a sat-nav, if you use a smartphone, if you buy a financial services product, if you search the internet, then you're using some very advanced forms of artificial intelligence. The revolution is happening, it's just not being mentioned or televised. And that's part of the problem. We've got to wake ourselves up to say, how do we as organizations and individuals wake up to how the world is changing and make conscious choices about what we want in our future? And what we know is pretty much every sector is going to transform itself in the next 5 years. It will transform beyond belief. And the question is, how do we get there? Do we play by the existing rules? You know, we're lawyers, we're accountants, we're architects, we're car manufacturers. We're trained roughly the same way as our competitors. We know who they are. If they do something, we know why they've done it. We can probably second guess what they'll do next and vice versa. And so we kind of tend to operate within a frame of reference. The problem is that we're now seeing people coming in and saying, actually, to win in your industry, not only am I not going to play by your rules, I'm actually going to change the whole game. So in telecoms, every telecoms company will tell you that they had the idea first to give away free telephone calls over the internet, but they couldn't work out how they'd make money, so they didn't do it. Along came Skype and did exactly that. Free calls over the internet. They now handle 40% of all international voice traffic with 1,600 staff. They're changing the game. And we're seeing this in industry after industry. They're not necessarily being reinvented by the players we know, they're being reinvented by people we've never met before who we didn't even know existed. And so one of the questions becomes, is this time for a reset? And Linda talked about this, John talked about this. We all have assumptions, we all have stories, we all have a view about how the world works. We have to have a simplified view because the world is too complicated to deal with everything. And those stories and assumptions and myths are great because they help us deliver our strategy. And they're great until they're not. And this is what's happening for a lot of organizations. Those assumptions, those worldviews, the things that made us successful are beginning to run out. But now what we see is that we can't just put in a new set of stories and myths. We actually have to change what we're being as an organization, not just what we're doing. And at the heart of that is about how do we inspire passion, how do we create a place where people love being or can create what they'd love to do, how do we drive intuition, how do we fire the imagination, because that's the only way we're going to navigate into the future and create what we want, rather than be the respondents to other people's strategies. And what we know is that, throughout our work over the last 15 years in this stuff, there are some very simple rules about what makes a company successful in terms of exploring the future. And one of them is about taking a long-term perspective, looking at 3 different horizons. So firstly, looking at what are we trying to do in the next 12 months? Are we very clear on the vital few things that will make a difference? Secondly, what do we want to do to drive innovation and growth in the next 3 years? And how is the world changing? What are the external factors that could influence that could help us deliver, that could get in the way or could create new options for us? And thirdly, it's looking longer term. What's coming over the horizon, the science and technology in particular, the new ideas that could completely change the way we do business. So 3D printing, the aircraft manufacturers know that pretty much the next generation of aircraft will be largely 3D printed. They can't do it today because of regulation, but they know that's pretty much the only way they can have an economic model. Now, what you can't do is, or most of us can't do, is to say, okay, if I know what's coming 3 to 10 years' time, I can write a strategy for 3 to 10 years' time. The world is changing too much. But what we can do is if we understand that and we understand the different possible scenarios for what might happen, then we can come back to the present and say, let's create a strategy in the next 3 years that's about reinventing our business, creating the flexibility, the innovation mindset, and the agility so that in 2 to 3 years' time, we're ready for anything. We have completely transformed our business to be able to respond whatever happens. And what we know is that there are some fundamental resets happening. Work is a very old concept. It's not something that we invented. It's been around for a long time. And we have different attitudes to work. So on the one hand, there are people who hate their job, feel like they've got to do it, but it doesn't bring them pleasure. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've got people who, take great pleasure from what they do and absolutely rejoice. Does anyone know what this group of people are? Or who this group of people are? This is the team of female-led scientists that put India's first mission on to Mars in 2014. Largely female-led, cost $72 million to do. That's about the same cost as putting on a Justin Bieber tour. So we're in a really interesting territory here. But and this raises some very fundamental questions because on the one hand, People are saying, well, work is so ingrained in our culture and our history and our stories. It gives us meaning, it gives us purpose, it provides the money to do the things we want to do, to feed our family. I'm defined through my work, it creates opportunity. And we look down on people in different ways through our culture, through our language, on anyone who doesn't have a job. We're shocked by someone who gives up a job. We have a term called unemployed, which generally isn't seen as a positive term for people who haven't got jobs. But that's going to change. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have the techno-progressives, the people who are driving the science and technology, who are celebrating what's coming next and saying, isn't it fantastic? Robots, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, driverless vehicles. This will eliminate pretty much all the jobs we have in the world. It will free us up from the drudgery of work. It will free us up to do more interesting things, whether that's pursuing education throughout our lives and being creative, whether it's entertainment in all sorts of forms, whether it's elder care. And these could be the big growth industries of the future. But they're saying, actually, we can reset society. That the advances in science and technology could bring about a massive shift in opportunity, but we have to change our mindset to do it. So we're at a really interesting tipping point where this conversation is playing out. On the one hand, people saying, how do we create jobs? And what is it going to take to sustain jobs in the future? And another group who are saying, actually, we're eliminating the need to have a job in any form. And the question is, well, how are we going to deal with that economically? And so there's a growing view that actually what we need is a universal guaranteed income that would tax the profits of the corporations that are using the robots to do everything. We'll tax them slightly more, and we'll use that to fund some sort of guaranteed income for people. And then they can choose to do what you want. And there are already experiments going on. I was talking to someone a couple of weeks ago from Libya, and they were saying that actually, in a workforce where you've got 200 employees, maybe 100 of them are on the payroll, and 100 of them are on some sort of state guaranteed income, but they're coming into the workplace because it gives them context, it gives them communication, it gives them contact, it gives them connection. So and they want to be seen as productive. We're seeing Holland, Finland, Namibia, Canada, all sorts of countries now starting to explore whether we're going to need this because of all the stuff we've been hearing all day long about the number of jobs that could go and the fact that the new industries of the future will be highly automated and may not need as many people. So people are starting to think about what are the consequences of this for society. We also know that there's some fundamentally big shifts happening in terms of the nature of what business is, and almost two different schools of thought now playing out in the sort of tech titans who are driving the future. On the one hand is the kind of Star Wars mentality that says the goal is to eliminate the competition, really take everyone out, and be the winner. If we think about search, who can name the number 2 search company? Who can name the number 2 taxi app? The number 2 online book retailer? These players have deliberately gone out to try and eliminate or buy up their competition and to be, winner takes all, or winner takes almost all. But then there's another group who are saying, actually, the advances in science and technology that are coming give us the potential for abundance, and we could be moving closer to a Star Trek economy, where in the first Star Trek series, there was no money. If you wanted something, you basically printed it on your 3D printer, and it was the assumption of a society built on abundant science and technology. Now, Star Trek was ahead of its time, but basically what it was drawing on was a whole set of ideas which we're now starting to see develop. These advances in science and technology, from 3D and 4D printing, to hyperconnectivity, to synthetic materials, all of which are moving at an exponential rate. Exponential means we're not just kind of improving 5, 10, or 100% each year, we're doubling or more our performance. And the whole idea has already been driven from the technology world, where Moore's law tells us that roughly every 18 to 24 months, the amount of computer power we can buy for $1,000 is doubling. But we're now seeing the same thing happening in all sorts of other fields. So the speed with which we can sequence a genome, the rate at which we're able to manufacture down at the nanoscale. In a number of different sectors, we're seeing these kind of exponential developments that are changing existing industries, but also creating the industries of tomorrow. And they're driving what is truly disruptive innovation potential. So this that you see on your screen is something called Hyperloop. This is a train service that would take you from San Francisco to LA in 30 minutes. It's inside an evacuated tube. It will run at about 4,000 kilometers an hour, and they're testing the prototype this year in California. And you look at governments in the Middle East, even I think Slovakia is looking at using this as its train service. The number of governments around the world that are getting very interested in this because the cost is going to be fractional of what it would cost to build a normal rail service, and the cost of operation is going to be incredibly low. The guys running this are saying governments could almost give away mass transport for free, but they're also saying we'll transport water, fuel, and goods in these things. So we could totally change supply chains and do it in a much more environmentally friendly manner with a much lower resource footprint. To me, that's truly disruptive innovation, not just checking into a hotel with an app. This is what I would see. So we're seeing this happening. And we're seeing it in all sorts of sectors. We talked about driverless cars a few times today. You know, we're seeing next year the UK will allow driverless trucks on the road. There was an experiment to have trucks with no drivers. They'll drive in a convoy, and basically the front truck will lead the convoy. We will see driverless vehicles hit the roads way earlier than most of us think. In the US, and I think it's now 6 states, have made driverless vehicles legal. The rate of acceleration of people's work in this field is just incredible. And Linda this morning talked about aging as another kind of fundamental shift. And what's interesting is, if we follow the kind of what the actuaries are telling us, then we know the fastest growing age group in the UK are the over 80s. Today, average life expectancy is about 80 in the UK. Around the world, life expectancy is rising. But what we're seeing is the potential for dramatic shifts there. So anyone in this room who's under 50, you have a 90% chance of living to 100. If you're over 50, don't make quite so many long-term plans. We know our kids, someone who's born today, a child born today in the UK, has a reasonable expectation of living to 120 without medical advances. And then you're seeing the research going on longevity drugs. There's a drug called metformin, which is for people with diabetes, and they're now discovering that in the right dosage, it can actually extend life expectancy. And all the pharma companies are getting into this. There's also work going on to do radical life extension. I mentioned Google. There are people working on extending the life expectancy of different species. They've been able to successfully extend the life expectancy of a fruit fly by 10 times by identifying the proteins that control aging. They're the building blocks of our genes. They think with humans we could get a 2 to 5 times increase in life expectancy by doing the same thing. How do you motivate the 190-year-old sales director? What do you buy your life partner for their 200th birthday? And think about marriage. Right? Some of us struggle with a deal that lasts 60 years. Imagine saying yes and it binds you together for 120 or more. But divorce just become compulsory after 30 years. You know, so we reduce the murder rate. We're entering really new territory. We are moving into a space that is beyond our understanding. We're also moving into a space where we're extending what it means to be a human. This whole field of research called human augmentation or human enhancement is moving at an accelerated pace. So already there are drugs like Ritalin, modafinil, Adderall, which are meant for attention deficit disorder or sleep disorder. And what people are doing is using those drugs to enhance their concentration and performance. Up to 90% of students in some US universities now admit to using these drugs for their concentration. You're seeing investment banks asking their staff to use these drugs instead of cocaine, because if you want your staff to work 20 hours a day, 7 days a week for 6 weeks on a transaction, you know it's more than strong coffee that's keeping them going. And so actually giving them these drugs might help. The US military gives these drugs to pilots when they're on missions, so they're not worrying about how their football team did, or the argument they had with their partner, or what am I going to have for dinner, all those normal human reactions. We're starting to see human enhancement drugs being moved. We're also seeing the rise of genetic enhancement. So there's a technique called CRISPR-Cas9 that's been piloted that will allow us to modify skin color, the thickness of your hair, the color of your eyes, the texture of your skin. And people are already starting to talk about creating high street shops where, in the same way as you can go and get a tattoo or a piercing, in 5 years' time they believe that some countries will have licensed these techniques to go and modify your genes. One of the kind of most interesting things is clearly the future isn't evenly distributed. So some of us might think, well, I've not even heard of this. But right now, you can buy kits on the internet to modify your genetics. And the future is just very unevenly distributed. And the challenge for all of us is, how do we wake up? How do we create that culture inside our organization, that mindset to look to the future and understand what's coming next? And what we are seeing is some businesses really starting to embrace that, starting to say, how do we do things in a fundamentally different way to keep pace with the changing world? This is a construction company in China called Broad Group that built this 30-story hotel in 15 days. Because their clients were saying, we can't wait 18 months to 3 years for you to build it. You need to reinvent the way you do construction. So now they make everything in the factory, and they plug it together on site like kids' Lego blocks. And we're seeing more and more of these kind of rapid construction projects. This is just one example of exponential thinking being brought to traditional industries. You're seeing it happen in industry after industry. So if you look at Airbnb, they handle 90 times more bedrooms per employee than Hilton Group. You look at Tangerine Bank, they can handle 7 times more customers per employee than the average bank. The one that blows my mind, though, is Local Motors, who can come up with a new car design about 1,000 times cheaper than the traditional car manufacturers, and who can produce those cars 5 to 22 times faster. The really interesting thing is that the people working in these organizations are not from a different planet. They're exactly the same as the people you employ. The only difference is that they've been allowed to unleash their passion. They've been asked the question, how would we do this? Not why can't we do this, or not give me a list of 400 reasons why it will be difficult, but how would we half the time it takes us to fulfill an order? How would we recruit a new employee in 1 day? How would we get a product to market 10 times faster? And they're just giving themselves permission to think differently. Now, Local Motors, you're saying, well, how is that possible? What are they doing to think so differently? Well, the typical Ford has about 5,000 components. The typical 3D printed Strati has 50. Just bringing a totally different mindset to bear in order to achieve the desired outcome. And what we're seeing is that this has a massive impact on their market cap. You look at Uber, end of 2014 was valued at $40 billion. End of 2015 valued at $60 billion. Roughly the equivalent of Ford and General Motors combined. But you try talking to any human inside Uber. You can't reach them. We're creating almost virtual corporations with massive valuations. A fundamentally different mindset. And Uber don't see themselves as a taxi company. They do home deliveries. They'll be getting into recruitment, they've said. They literally see themselves as a capacity recycler. Wherever there's spare capacity, they now have the engine to do that. And what we're seeing is all of this is sort of happening before we really dive deep into the potential of artificial intelligence. We're now seeing, and we heard this morning from Linda about how powerful artificial intelligence is becoming. AI is basically developing systems that can mimic the way humans learn, that can learn and adapt over time, can look at data sets and get smarter and smarter and start to make their own decisions. So, we've all heard about Google's AlphaGo, that basically it wasn't taught how to play Go. It was taught how to learn. And then it watched Go players for a while. It watched lots of games of Go to learn how to play. It basically got a signal each time it made a good move, a reward. And just like we teach children, they've been teaching this software. It then took on the world-leading Go champion, and it won 4-1. The AI nerds amongst us are quite excited by it winning 4-1, but what we're really excited about was one move in Game 3, where the system had learned so much that it had started to become creative. And it made a move that people don't believe any human has ever, they don't think any human has ever made that, or certainly in recorded history. No one would imagine a human making that. It also did something else, which we normally associate with humans, which is it started to exercise some psychological tactics. It started to game its opponent and trick its opponent into doing things because it had studied its behavior. It was learning its behavior, the human's behavior. Go is a really incredibly tough game. There are potentially 560 million plus moves that you can make in Go. So it's not an easy game to learn. The excitement here is that if we can have a system that can start to generate that sort of creativity, then we could use it in all sorts of problem-solving areas, solving food chains, coming up with new tax systems, health problems. Then actually, if we can have something that creates ideas that no human would ever have done, there is no domain where it couldn't be applied. And that's where I think I would challenge some of what Linda says. I think the high-end professional stuff, we are going to see it being used all the way through the spectrum, not just in the middle of her charts. And we're already seeing the kind of next step of that, which is the idea of fully automated enterprises. You know, Uber is almost a fully automated enterprise with no employees, but you're seeing companies today where they literally have no employees, they're just software. And there's this vision that says, actually, one of the companies of the future could be a self-owning company. So the driverless vehicle could become a self-owning taxi. That instead of paying the manufacturer for that taxi, the driverless vehicle would rent itself out all day long, would publish its accounts on the internet, and everyone involved in manufacturing that car, providing fuel or electricity, cleaning it, everyone involved would get a share of the revenues, but actually it would be owned by itself. And so you're seeing a lot of people working on this idea of what would self-owning assets, self-owning companies, what are the new models for the future that might emerge as a result of the potential of artificial intelligence and some of these other technologies. So what this leads us to is this idea that we could be moving into a world with multiple actors, that tomorrow's workplace could have humans, it could have enhanced humans, it could have artificial intelligent agents, it could have robots. It can have all sorts of entities in the workplace. And for us as HR, we can either wait for it to happen, and then say, well, wow, how do we deal with that? Or we can start to preempt it and start to say, how do we think these things through? How will we do conflict resolution? Who will manage a team when the robot and the AI are working 24/7, 365, and the humans are daring to go home at night and take holidays? How will we make sure we make very human choices about the way we do this? And what we know is, with all these technologies coming, technology is going to be at the heart of our story. We have to make sure that we have a grasp of technology and we understand how we can use it. And there have been various conversations that I've heard today about a lack of trust between the business or whatever. What we need is technologists who can help us understand what's coming next, not just at an operating level, but to say these technologies are coming, here are the possibilities they can create for our business. And that raises a big issue for a lot of us, which is that there's a very uneasy relationship between the IT function and the business in most organizations. Both think they're the child in this picture. The business thinks that the IT department only knows how to say no, doesn't let us do what we want to do, takes too long, costs too much, and holds us back. The IT people think that the business always want things at a ridiculous pace, they never provide enough money, they keep changing their mind. So one of the biggest challenges I think we face as an HR function is to make sure the organization appreciates how important skilled technologists are and technology strategists, and really make that a priority to bring in very, very smart people to lead technology if we're going to be technology-centric businesses in the future. Now, you've already heard and you saw in the video today that all of this technology innovation and change could drive a massive change in jobs. We could potentially lose 50% of all the jobs that exist today. Now, new industries might emerge, they might be created, but one of the opportunities here is to say, how do we encourage people to think very differently about what the opportunities are, to create their own job for the future? So rather than relying on big corporations to create the jobs of tomorrow, how do we as companies, actually in creating our own strategy, also facilitate our employees to create the jobs of tomorrow? And we're seeing more and more examples of this now, where companies, instead of making people redundant, are setting aside a fund for their employees to go off and investigate new opportunities and create their own businesses. And then maybe the company has a share, maybe they give them just space to work, but they're trying different models to help their employees navigate into the future. And they're creating different kinds of ecosystems with current employees, past employees, and a variety of people around them. They're having to think about very different models for how you organize for tomorrow. We're also going to have to make some very tough choices about to what extent will we deliberately make a conscious choice to employ humans in the workforce versus moving towards full automation. And I hear different stories. I talk to the business people who say we're going to grow the workforce, and then I talk to the IT people in the same organization who say my mandate is to automate so that we can cut 30% of headcount. You know, and so I don't know who's telling the truth there, but what we do know is there is a very strong potential for jobs to be eliminated, so we have to make conscious choices about how we navigate that. Another issue that we see rising in this kind of choice about the future is how do we make sure we don't lose the feminine in our organizations? As we automate, as we potentially eliminate a lot of roles, how do we make sure we maintain the feminine? Things like culture, things like connection, things like learning, things like serendipity that happen when people get together. The reason you guys come to a conference like this, I mean, you could watch the videos online, you could consume the content online, but you're coming for connection, those kinds of things. Things that we would say are feminine characteristics, not female, but feminine. And you're seeing it right now in artificial intelligence, where a lot of the AI software being built, the assumptions that underpin the learning systems are very male assumptions, very male ways of thinking. The women in the room are getting this, and the guys are going, what are you talking about? Very simple example, the difference between the masculine and the feminine. A guy walks into a room, sees a woman's looking unhappy, the woman they know, what's the first thing they will say? What's up? What's the first thing the woman will say? Nothing, right. The guy will say, great, well, fantastic conversation, thank you, let's do this again, and leave. What the woman is really saying is, if you care, sit down, listen to me for 20 minutes to 2 hours, let me talk through everything I'm thinking about here, so you understand it, you feel me, you understand a different perspective about how I'm looking at a situation or making decisions. Quite a lot of men don't get that. But actually, if we lose the feminine in our organizations, we could lose what makes us unique. And it's kind of difficult for some people to really get their heads around that, but I think it's going to be one of the most critical choices. So what do we do about all this? How do we rethink our enterprise to make sure we're creating something that people are passionate about? Whether it's the future of the organization itself or creating opportunities for the people within the organization who might leave it and do something different. And you know, I think there's a very simple process we can follow here that we're seeing a lot of companies started to do. The first is to create some teams of future scouts. So we're doing this at the moment with a big European car company where we're taking members of the executive team and then a whole bunch of leaders and emerging leaders from across the organization, and we put them into 10 teams. And their job is to explore 10 different questions about the future. So rather than putting them in a lecture theatre and talking to them about the future, they're going and finding it. Whether it's how are people going to manufacture in the future, what are the technologies that are coming, how might 3D printing impact us. But the really interesting thing is, we're not asking the manufacturing people to go and look at what 3D printing can do. We're actually getting marketing and sales people as part of those teams. And what's already happening is that the manufacturing people and design people have said, oh, it's 10 years before we can 3D print a car. The sales and marketing guys have gone out and looked at the marketplace and said, well, people are already doing this. And already they've started a project within the organization to explore how they can use 3D printing both in manufacturing but also in their spares business. And these projects are designed to be done in an accelerated way within 120 days to go out and explore the future and bring back new conversations. They're looking at what could happen over those 3 different time horizons, so not just what's going on now, but what could happen in the future. They're scanning the future, they're coming back and creating conversations with their colleagues, with customers, with suppliers, to explore what all this could mean. And then the next stage is to say, let's use these insights to create 2 or 3 different scenarios for how our world could play out. Because there isn't one possible future from where we stand today. There are many different possible futures, many different scenarios. And then based on that, we can build our strategies for the next 1 to 3 years. If we have these scenarios for how the world might play out in 5 to 10 years' time, then we can come back and say, what do we need to do to build the capability inside the organization in the next few years to make sure we can respond to whatever happens in the longer term? I don't believe that HR can lead the transformation in most organizations. I don't think they're given the mandate. But what we can do is to start the conversation. We can put these kind of processes in front of our leaders and say, here is a way we can start to navigate the future. Here is a way we can start to drive that culture change through innovation, through new projects, through a process that really connects the people in the organization who might be resisting change and helps them connect to what's changing in the marketplace so they learn for themselves and then come back and drive change and drive culture change. On the back of that, then we know we've got to build some new muscles. New ways of working, faster experimentation, prototyping, a range of different ways of thinking. We also know that we've got to take an axe to the complexity in our organizations. Quite often we say we can't do something because we've got too much going on, there's too many reasons why we can't respond to something new. The simpler we can be inside the organization, the faster we can respond to what comes next. It also means looking at the skills agenda. Are we equipping people with the skills to navigate tomorrow? Scenario thinking, problem solving, design thinking. it means really starting to think very differently about how we equip our workforce for the world we're moving into. My time's up here. What I've talked about, I guess, is quite a radical departure for some of you in terms of how we envisage the organization, how we deal with what's coming next, how we open the mindsets. But I think we have to kind of see ourselves as agents of change, facilitators of change, and have the courage to start those conversations. The author Graham Greene says there comes a time in everyone's life when you have to open the door and let the future in. I guess the reason you're all at a Future of Work conference is that that door is very firmly open for you. I hope all the content today has really given you some ideas on what sits on the other side of that door and how you as HR can really help facilitate that journey into the future. Thank you.